Well, there are obvious answers that have been out there for the last 10 years in the context of copyright. To give up the sense that the sole objective of copyright is to give a copyright owner control over how work gets used, and to focus instead on ways to assure compensation for the work being used. Compensation for the harm caused by peer-to-peer file sharing. So this is an idea at the center of the book by my colleague Terry Fisher. It's an idea behind the Green Party in Germany's movement for what they call a cultural flat rate that would raise the funds necessary to compensate artists for the harm that they've suffered because of peer-to-peer file sharing. Or in the context of journalism, my friend and colleague Robert McChesney in this powerful book argues that again we need to recognize the need for public support for public goods, and investigative journalism is a public good. So whether through foundations like ProPublica or the government through things like National Public Radio, we need to find ways to complement what the market is providing, as historically in the United States we always have. And finally, in the context of transparency, or what we could call trust, we need to remove the cause of mistrust. We need to change private funding of public elections into public funding of public elections. Small dollar funded elections that would make it impossible for people to believe, or reasonably to believe, that any particular decision was made because of the money. To make it impossible for them to believe, as the vast majority believe, that money buys results. The point is, in all three cases, we accept and we celebrate the internet, but we find ways to accommodate and minimize the harm that the internet pushes. Yet today, in activists and governments across the world, no one is yet pursuing this balanced set of responses. Instead, across the world, extremism in this debate rules. So, for example, in the context of copyright, in the United States, we wage a war. Actually, we wage many wars. So, the copyright war is the particular one I want to speak of. A war which my friend, the late Jack Valenti, former head of the Motion Picture Association of America, used to refer to as his own, quote, terrorist war, where apparently the terrorists in this war are our children. Or in the context of journalism, public funding for journalism has been cut in the United States, believing that the private market can provide all that there is. Or in the context of trust, even though the cost of campaigns in the United States has skyrocketed, and members of our Congress spend up to 30 to 70% of their time raising money to get reelected to Congress, the Supreme Court of the United States just this year struck down any constitutional basis for Congress to limit corporate spending to support a candidate. Corporations have an unlimited right to spend as much money as they want, independent of a campaign to support or oppose any candidate, only exacerbating the current perception that money buys results. We live in this age of extremes. Everywhere we are extremists. We need to learn regulatory humility. The 20th century was this odd century where technology made possible a certain totalitarian way of thinking. Totalizing theories flourished. Technologies like these were first conceived of by governments as tools for propaganda of their citizens. And the 20th century and these technologies launched massively ambitious and often brutal regulations designed to control or remake society. So whether you think of the extremes of Stalin or the extremes of Prohibition or the aspirations of FDR or the current war against drugs or the Great Society of LBJ or the war in Iraq, the mentality is the same. The mentality is that government has the power to control and remake society. And the belief that when its effort to remake slows, the reality is that more force will mean more effective regulation. That relationship, that more force means more effective regulation, is false. In a democracy, not in a totalitarian state, more force often means less effective regulation. As my colleague Cass Sunstein demonstrates, the nudge is often better than the knock. Norms are better than jail. We need to relearn this. All of us need to relearn this. This humility about the potential for government to change the world. Because the extremists have forgotten this on both sides. The extremists on the left, the extremists on the right, they too need to remember the limits to what government can do, the natural constraints within a democracy. These constraints, which need to inspire humility about what government does, especially when you think back to the first point that I made in this talk this morning, the point about generations. Because when we recognize that the current war that we wage in the context of internet technology is a war against our kids, we have to recognize the need for this humility. We enforce ever more vigorously restrictions on how they use and behave on the internet, and they resist these restrictions ever more destructively. What we need to recognize, we, older than Gen Y, we who don't yet understand what these technologies can do, we need to recognize that you cannot kill these technologies. You can only criminalize them. We can't stop our kids from being creative in ways that none of us, or at least I certainly wasn't when I was growing up. We can only drive that creativity underground. We can't make them passive. We can only make them pirates. And the question we need to ask is that any good? In my country, kids live in this age of prohibition. In all sorts of contexts of their life, they live life against the law. That is deeply corrosive, deeply corrupting of the rule of law in a democracy. Internet is freedom, but what is freedom? Freedom is that which begets good and bad. And the mature response to freedom is to minimize the bad to protect the good. And the sane response of any government is to fight no hopeless war. What we need is governments of maturity and sanity. Governments that recognize the regulatory humility that the failures of the 20th century should have taught us. Not just governments that are young and arrogant, but governments everywhere in the world.